Let me show you how to use the annuity factor calculator. Um, this is a workbook powered by the Actuarial Excel Addin functions. It calls the JS, the LX, and the CIA functions. So you have a few worksheets in the workbook. First, the user guide. There are three steps involved in using the calculator. First, you go to the settings worksheet and you have two selections to make. First, the regional setting for your computer. Also, the country for the mortality table. So it's either Canada or United States. Next step, you have to go to the annuitant worksheet and enter the information on the annuitants. I've already entered four separate annuitant. So for each of them, you have a name. The age of the annuitant is sex, the age of the co-annuitant, and the sex of the spouse. You could either enter ages or you could enter dates of birth. And if you enter dates of birth, then you have to enter a date of calculation. The third step, you go to the annuity factor worksheet. That's where the annuity factors will be calculated. And there are the cells you have to fill are the yellow one. Those the required field are the lemon yellow one. So first you specify which annuitant you're doing calculation for. So here I have the choice between 1 and 4. So let's say I select 1. The other required information that must be entered is the interest rate. You can select either the CIA 3500 interest rate assumption for the calculations of transfer value or commuted value of pension. So if I set it to false, then I have to enter a vector of interest rate. Could be a single rate or a vector, let's say 3% for the first 4 years, 5% thereafter. That would be a valid vector. Or I can continue with another period of 2 years, let's say for the 5%, and finally with the 2% interest rate. So this is another valid vector for interest rate. Next, you enter the information on the indexation. Let's say I select 1%. And notice that the annuity factor is adjusted when you enter new input. Also notice that the default value for the inputs are in the dark green box. So you have the annuity characteristic here, you have the assumptions for indexation here, and you have the for the mortality tables here. So continuing with the indexation, say I select the CIA assumptions for indexation, then I have to remove the 1%. And it shows me that the CIA is for the month of November 2021, and the indexation rate are 1.40% for the first 10 years and 2.05% thereafter. So let's select for the interest rate the CIA assumption also. So you have for the interest rate also for the month of November 2021, you have 2.2% for the first 10 years and 3% thereafter. So continuing with the indexation, I've selected the CIA assumption. I can make adjustment to the CIA assumption by offsetting by a set percentage, for example, let's say 0.25. I can reduce my indexations by a percentage. Let's say I set my percentage at 75%, and I could also set the maximum to any percentage, let's say 1.25%. So my rate too has been adjusted accordingly. Next, mortality assumptions. If I select the CIA calculation, then I won't be allowed to select a mortality table. You'll see it shows me an invalid input, invalid under CIA 3500. So I have to leave it blank, or because the program or the worksheet is selecting the appropriate mortality table and projection scales, there's no loading and no adjustment in the ages. And the annuity factor is calculated here. Going back to the annuity characteristic, there's a guarantee. This is the number of years the pension is guaranteed. Then the reversion to the spouse, the deferred period. So if my person is age 63, if the pension starts at 65, I would enter 2, for example. Temporary payments are for bridge pension if it's payable to age 65. So I would set here my, I could say 65 minus my age if I want, whatever. And the frequency of payment, the default value is 12. The pension is payable 12 times per year. Or I could select another frequency, 24 times per year, 52 times per year, and the annuity factor will adjust accordingly. Next is either the payment of benefit is due or not. If it's due, the payment is done at the beginning of the month. So it's true by default. And if I set it to false, then the payment will be made at the end of the period. So I have a 52 times per year frequency, so weekly. So my payment will be made at the end of each week. Finally, the mortality during deferment. By default, there is mortality during the deferment period. Mortality on the first annuitant only. I could set it to false, so there will be no mortality during the deferment period. Going back to the age of first indexation, the program calculated as a default value at 63 plus my deferment period. So 65 plus 1 year. It's always payable. The first indexation is always 1 year after the first payment, and it would be further deferred if due is false. So if it's payable at the end of the period, then in this situation it will be further deferred by 1/50 If it's monthly, it will be deferred by another 1/12 of a year. So in 66.08. The fraction applied on first indexation, by default, there's no adjustment, so it's a full indexation. But if you have new retiree situations where there's a proration made on the first indexation, you would specify it here. For example, I could say 0.5 for, so only half of indexation will be applied on the first indexation date. Thereafter, it would be full indexation. So if I remove all these input to show you how to select the mortality assumption, okay, we're all set now. So in the mortality assumption, you could select the sex. By default, it's the sex of my annuitant and co-annuitant, but I could if I want unisex rates, I would say let's 1.2 for example, and maybe 1.2 for the spouse too. So in this situation, the mortality rates will be 80% male and 20% female for both the annuitant and co-annuitant. Then I select the mortality table. Since my settings are, since I've selected United States table, my drop-down list will only show United States or US mortality table. By default, it's the RP 2014A, and you have the description of the table below. The RP 2014A is the rates for LT annuitant. Could select any other table for the co-annuitant. Could be separate assumptions, set of assumptions for the annuitant and co-annuitant. Shift in age. It's either you want older mortality rate plus or a younger mortality rate minus. So let's say I want younger in both situations. So it's by shifted by 2 years. Loading of the mortality, it could be negative or positive. So it could run from minus 100% to plus 1,000%. So from no mortality to 11 times the mortality rate. Let's say minus 0.15, for example. And you see always my annuity factor is adjusted, whatever I enter. Here I don't have a reversion, so okay. I select 50% to the co-annuitant. And finally, the projection scale. I have the scale from 2014 to 2020, MP to 2020, for example. and the same for the spouse, and that's how it works. So you see here, it's in these the information in the dark green cells have been adjusted on my based on my selection, and there are two worksheets we haven't looked at yet. The list is where all the tables and all the lists are kept for the program, so you can view these lists, but you cannot modify them. So I have the country, for example, language, sex, reversion, frequency, Boolean for some test or some selection. You have the Canada mortality table, Canada projection scale, and the US mortality table and the US projection scale. Lastly, the transfo worksheet is where some intermediate calculations are done. Again, you can have a look at the sheet, but you cannot access the cells or modify them. So the only fields you can modify are the yellow boxes in the annuity factor worksheet, the annuitant worksheet, and the setting worksheet. I hope you will find the annuity factor calculator useful. Bye.